Hello everyone, welcome to the Drydock episode 246. This week the questions are taken from guides 296 and 297 to HMS Gloucester and HMS Janus, and then the Wednesday videos the Regia Marina with regards to submarine Suda Bay in the Black Sea, and Operation Neptune, the naval side of the D-Day landings. This was also the fortnight period when I released the video on Bismarck and the James Cameron expedition, comparing what you see online with what the report that was written for the expedition actually says. And so this episode will be slightly longer than your average hour, just to account for a few of those questions. And speaking of questions, the mighty Nanto asks, the Illustrious and Essex class carriers were known for their durability due to their armoured decks, but how much damage would a German glide bomb such as an HS-293 or a Fritz X do to them? There would be two very different cases of damage. An HS-293 is essentially an 1,100 pound or 500 kilo bomb with some wings attached to it. Now, whilst that bomb weight is more than the armoured decks of either type of carrier were designed to deal with, the flip side is that the weapon is coming in at somewhat more of an angle than an equivalent bomb dropped by a dive bomber. It's also not an armour-piercing or semi-armour-piercing weapon, it's a general-purpose weapon, and the Germans aim to use the HS-293 to sink small warships and unarmoured vessels, which pretty much shows in as much as the vast majority of HS-293 victims are destroyers, frigates, and merchant ships, or other forms of transport ship. The only large-ish victim of an HS-293 is a Dido class, which is a fairly small light cruiser. So, although it would hurt, an HS-293 strike probably isn't going to do too much to an Illustrious or an Essex. It would probably, assuming the normal area of impact, do slightly less damage to an Illustrious just because there's more armour on the exterior to get in the way. If it strikes the upper section of an Essex class, i.e. flight deck or the sides of the hangar deck, it might do a little bit more damage because it's going to be more likely to get inside the hangar and explode. And we saw with Franklin and Bunker Hill what happens if something gets inside the hangar of an Essex class that's in the middle of combat ops and explodes. But a single HS-293 is very unlikely to actually destroy one of these carriers. At most, you're going to get severe damage, and that severe damage is probably going to be more from what's on board the carrier being set off. The actual bomb explosion itself, let's say if the carrier has already launched most of its air group for a strike and has secured the hangar, it'll be annoying, but the ship can probably be made serviceable unless it's hit in a particularly vulnerable spot in relatively quick time. The Fritz X, on the other hand, that's a whole other kettle of fish, because the Fritz X is based on a 1,400 kilo or 3,100 pound bomb, and it comes in from a generally much deeper angle. Now, exactly how much damage that's actually going to do to an Essex or Illustrious, it's not going to be good, but we can roughly take some estimates by looking at some of the bigger ships like Italia, Roma, and Warspite, and some of the cruisers as well that were hit. Now, the problem the Fritz X has is it's actually probably going to be over-penetrating most targets. That's why some of the smaller ships that were hit by Fritz X's survived. And when you look at the larger ships, it seems that once it's hit something strong enough to initiate the fuse, which will probably be the armoured deck, wherever that happens to be, either the flight deck or the hangar deck, depending on if it's the Illustrious or the Essex, it usually seems to go about 5 or 6 decks in height through the ship before exploding. Now, very crudely, assuming you're hitting roughly amidships, that means that if you hit an Illustrious class, the most likely area that that's going to explode in is going to be roughly in the top or halfway down through the machinery spaces, so very similar to the hit that disabled Warspite. Now, that's obviously a very bad thing. If you have a very large bomb exploding inside your machinery spaces or equivalent space, you're going to probably lose all power and propulsion, at least for a while, and there's going to be a lot of water to deal with as well. So A single Fritz X hitting roughly amidships is almost certainly going to cripple an Illustrious class, but based on what happened with a number of other ships that were hit by Fritz X's and suffered a bomb detonation in a similar position, assuming that they're able to get some of the other boilers back online, get the fires going again, and so forth, the ship can probably survive and make it home. Now, the problem with the Essex class is that its armour deck is it's one level, but in terms of overall deck heights, 2 deck heights further down on the hangar deck. Now, if we assume that the bomb isn't initiated by the flight deck, which, to be fair, it probably isn't going to be, at least a bomb of this size, that means it's going to explode a little bit lower down in the ship, or possibly just outside of the ship, because its most likely trajectory will carry it either into the double bottom of the ship or actually through the ship and into the water, which again happened with a number of Fritz X impacts, and it'll explode down there. Now, in terms of the damage to the ship's propulsive machinery, that will be somewhat obviously mitigated because more of the blast is being expended in the water, but it's also very likely to blow a socking great hole in the underside of the ship, which will also disable any machinery in the nearby space fairly quickly via flooding. So I think at that point, the Essex class materially will be in somewhat more danger because statistically it's likely to have a lot more water having been admitted into the bottom. But whether or not that is going to threaten the ship's ability to stay afloat, I think is going to very much depend on where it hits. If it hits right next to a bulkhead that divides 2 machinery spaces and manages to blow that bulkhead open, that's considerably more of a threat than something that lands in the middle of a machinery space. And also, obviously, a hit that lands to the port or starboard side of the ship will initially be much more threatening because it's going to admit a lot of water into one side of the ship, which will cause it to heal quite severely. But as long as it's not too much water to compromise the buoyancy, you can counter-flood against that. So it's all a little bit of swings and roundabouts, I think. But a Fritz X, on balance, will probably be slightly more of a threat to an Essex than an Illustrious. But that's based on, it's essentially very crude analysis of roughly how far did a Fritz X make it through the few large targets that it actually hit, and how does that relate to the height of aircraft carriers and their decks relative to where their armored decks are. So, it could equally be the other way around. A fuse that burns slightly longer that hits an Illustrious, or one that burns slightly shorter and hits an Essex, could turn that completely on its head. Brent Paulus asks, in such an event where the entire bridge crew is killed but the rest of the ship is relatively intact, was there a designated officer to take charge, or would there be a prolonged period of confusion while everyone tried to find the senior surviving officer? In the event that the bridge is taken out and the captain is killed, there is a designated system for how command should succeed. There will be an officer now, whether that's called the first lieutenant, the first officer, the executive officer, or something else, depends obviously on the Navy, but essentially, the ship's second in command should not be aboard the ship on the bridge at the same time the captain is on the bridge in a battle situation. They will have a separate battle station somewhere else in the ship, and their job then is to take over should the captain be killed. Exactly where that is largely down to the discretion of the officers in question. So at Jutland, for example, one of the ship's senior officers could be found in B turret. In other circumstances, you have the next in line for command is found in the conning tower when the captain's on the bridge, or if the captain's on the bridge or in the conning tower, he might be found on the bridge. In the last action of Bismarck, Lutyens and Lindemann were together, but Earls, the ship's first officer, was down in the forward damage control station. So the idea is pretty obvious, wipe out the command crew, the next senior most officer on the ship is somewhere else, and he can immediately take command. The main thing, if this kind of circumstance arises, is that everybody needs to know where that officer is, and that officer needs to have access to appropriate communication systems so that he can then take over and give the necessary orders. The latter bit being the most key, because usually any hit that's powerful enough to wipe out the bridge usually tends to do quite a number on the external communication systems of the ship, i.e. the communication systems that are outside the ship's citadel. So re-establishing those communications can sometimes take a while, again, depending on exactly where the hit is and what effect it's had. Wildcard asks, in the past Drydocks, you said a roughly 5-inch shell is about the largest size you can reasonably expect gun crews to hand load with any sort of urgency, whereas 6-inch and above will tend to have hydraulic rammers, and so forth. But I'm curious about HMS Hawkins. She has 7.5-inch guns, but also uses gun shields instead of full-blown gun turrets. Were her guns hand-loaded, or did she use rammers? And if she did, then how exactly was the mechanism kept safe from the elements and enemy fire? Well, the main problem with loading and firing the guns fairly rapidly isn't so much to do with whether or not you're using rammers, it's more just to do with the sheer weight of the shell. That's where you need the power assistance. But nonetheless, the 7.5-inch guns were essentially hand-loaded, and this was noted as being something of a problem at the time. You could only load them at angles up to about 10 degrees, which, with a power loading option, you would have been able to load at higher elevations, but also the sheer weight of the shells. The charges themselves weren't too bad, but the shells were quite heavy, and that meant that for getting the shells from the shell hoists over to the guns and then loaded in required significantly more manpower than was otherwise reasonable. And as I said at the time, this was noted and complained about, people saying, you know, if these ships went with 6-inch guns, we could do with a lot less crew for the primary battery, and if they were on with slightly heavier guns, we'd be forced to use proper turrets and proper loading mechanisms, which again would still cut down on the number of people. So you had this very inefficient but still vaguely workable, essentially chain gang of people helping each other to carry these rather heavy shells into the guns. Although for most of their career the ships did benefit from having a small electric and hydraulic system to help elevate and rotate the guns, that doesn't seem to have played any real part in the loading of them. Dace032 asks, I served in the Royal Air Force for 12 years. An old hat when I joined up told me a story that when the Queen is announced in front of the military, she is announced ladies, gentlemen and all members of the Royal Navy. This is to let Her Majesty know the Navy is present because they mutinied and she should be aware of that. Is this true? There are a number of conflicting sources on the origins of this. There are quite a few hypothesized origins, but there seem to be two that show up fairly regularly in some of the more reliable sources. Now, these indicate that the original introduction was ladies, gentlemen, and officers of the Royal Navy, so I guess all members of the Royal Navy, if that's a thing still. I don't know exactly. Maybe someone who's currently or recently in the Navy can clarify. Maybe they've just updated it to be a little bit more inclusive. Maybe they still use officers, who knows. But the two leading theories as to why this introduction is made is, number one, possibly that officers in the Royal Navy usually, at least in the late 18th and then 19th centuries, advanced by meritocracy rather than the commission purchase system that you could do in the army. And therefore you may have a captain or even an admiral who, due to his station, would be invited to high-class events, but may not be a gentleman in the British sense of having a landed title. So Sir or Earl, Duke, Marquess, whatever. And therefore, for social niceties to be observed, a distinction had to be made. So you would have the officers of the Royal Navy who may or may not actually be gentlemen, but were regardless accepted on the upper class social circle. The other element, the other suggestion, is that it loops back to things like the Spithead Mutiny and so on and so forth, which it would be more in line with what you heard, wherein the Navy obviously underwent a bunch of mutinies, and the distinction at that stage being that, well, I mean, it's not exactly like the other armed service at the period. The army didn't have discontent, but within the scope of whether the officers or the general members of the Royal Navy were viewed separately from ladies and gentlemen, that seems to split down into one of two subcategories. Either that generally the Royal Navy with a periodic history of mutinies was not to be trusted, but the other element potentially also being that the conduct of certain officers, which was usually the trigger for the largest number of Royal Navy mutinies, was not befitting a gentleman, and therefore it was a bit of a kind of a slap in the face of you can't be trusted to act like gentlemen. But I don't know, as I said, exactly what they specifically say these days, and indeed, as we just heard, there's a bunch of competing theories as to why it's said in the first place. Ernest Klein asks, with a name like HMS Janus, I got to wondering about catamarans as naval vessels. In the time period you cover, it seems their most significant use was as vessels for submarine salvage, with the most notable examples being SMS Vulcan and the Russian-Soviet-Russian again ship Volkov-Kommuna- a bunch of other stuff. Do they have any other uses as naval vessels? These days, potentially they do. Catamarans and trimarans can make a viable argument as to why they could or should be future frontline naval vessels, but in the time period that the channel covers, the catamaran hull is essentially restricted to things that require central heavy lifting, i.e. salvage ships and tenders, as you just mentioned. The main reasons for this are that the catamaran hull, if you're looking at a ship of a given length and width, the catamaran hull either is going to support less displacement for a given draft, because obviously there's less of it, there's a big void in the middle, or if you're going to support the same amount of overall weight, presumably through a lot of heavy stuff on the upper decks, then the hulls are going to have significantly deeper draft, which can be a problem for certain harbours. So if you want to keep a draft for a catamaran hull that is commensurate with the rest of naval operations, you're basically going to end up with a ship that is significantly larger for its displacement than average, which means it's going to cost more. And those dimensions might be a bit all over the place. So, for example, if you compare Kommuna with an Arethusa-class light cruiser from the First World War, they're within shouting distance of each other displacement-wise, but the Arethusa is considerably longer, but has considerably narrower beam because, of course, it's a monohull, whereas Kommuna has to spread its hulls out over, well, two individual hulls plus a space in the middle. On average, monohull ships of about her regular displacement tend to be 50 to 100 foot longer, but also tend to be about 50% narrower for a similar draft. This picture, of course, is SMS Vulcan, the predecessor and inspiration for Kommuna, of the German Navy, obviously. Now, the other problems you have with catamaran hulls is that if you catastrophically flood one side, it's much more difficult to redistribute that flooding and counter-flood, which is a problem in combat. Because of that much wider beam, your deck area to armour is going to be considerably larger, which is going to cost a huge amount of additional weight, and you still have to armour the bit in between the catamaran hulls, because otherwise a shell will come down in the middle and then penetrate the what's presumably unarmoured inside of the hull. And of course, when you're mounting guns, you want to have those guns on the centre line as much as possible, but guns require barbettes, they require deep magazines and shells and shell rooms and shell hoists and all this kind of stuff. And on a catamaran hull, the midship centre line is exactly where there's virtually nothing directly under the main deck, which would then mean you'd have to put the guns on either side of the ship, which would make it much less efficient. So in the era of gun-based warships, the catamaran hull really only has any kind of recommendation to it in a period when the ship's guns are mounted purely on its sides. So perhaps the central battery or broadside ironclad eras, there may have been some argument for a catamaran-hulled warship if someone built one, but once you get to centerline turrets, it's not really worth it anymore. Stefan Snedden asks, how does the Gabbiano class compare to the British Flower class? So for those of you who are unaware, this is a Gabbiano class corvette built by the Regia Marina during World War II. Now, to start with, we have to acknowledge one thing. The Gabbianos are a little bit smaller. So a flower displaces either just over 900 tons or in the modified flowers a little bit over 1,000 tons, whereas the Gabbianos displace between 650 and 700 tons. So yeah, they are just a fraction smaller. They're not that much shorter, believe it or not. There's maybe 10 foot in it, but they are also about 5 foot narrower, and they have a considerably shallower draft, which is why they displace so much less. Now, let's look at the other characteristics that you'd associate. Now, we're not going to look at protection because they're corvettes, they don't have armor. So we can look at speed, firepower, and then look at systems as well, and range. So range-wise, there's not a huge amount in it. The flowers can go a little bit further at their cruising speed, but it doesn't really make much odds for a ship this size. Crew efficiency-wise, the flower is a bit more efficient, 85 to 90 crew versus the Gabbianos, which need 110 crew, but there is a reason for that, which we'll come to in a minute. Systems-wise, they both have sonar, although obviously on flowers it's called Aztec, but unlike the Italians, the flower class generally also comes with some form of radar, an air search radar. So that's an advantage to the flowers. The Gabbianos are just a fraction faster, 18 knots versus 16 knots. And this is when we come to why the crew complement of the Gabbianos, despite them being a smaller ship, is just a little bit higher than that of a flower. So they both have a single, essentially 4-inch deck gun. On the flowers, it's actually 4 inches. On the Italians, it's 100mm or 3.9 inch. They both have depth charge throwers. The flower class also has a hedgehog ahead firing weapon. So overall, I mean, obviously the hedgehog being a slightly larger vessel can also carry slightly more depth charges, but in terms of anti-submarine warfare equipment, the hedgehog launchers on the flower class give it an advantage in the ASW section. As I said, in surface gunfire, they basically have a near enough identical weapon. But then you have the anti-aircraft guns. Now, obviously, the Gabbiano is built to operate in the Mediterranean, where it's guaranteed you will run into aircraft. The flowers are designed to operate in the Atlantic, initially not really facing much of an air threat, and then later on the air threat is still relatively limited. So the flowers as built have a couple of 50 cal machine guns, some mounting points for a few Lewis guns, that kind of stuff. And in the modified versions, like you would have seen on HMCS Sackville, there's a single 2-pounder 40mm pom-pom and a couple of 20mm Orlikans. The Gabbianos, on the other hand, have 7 of the Italian 20mm anti-aircraft guns, the Breda 24-65s, and this is pretty much, I think, what accounts for the additional crew, because each Orlikan mount is going to need its own little crew, gunner, loader, etc., and with 7 of those versus a maximum of 3 anti-aircraft guns on the modified flowers, there's your extra crew complement. The Gabbianos also have a couple of single torpedo tubes. They're fairly lightweight torpedoes. The flowers don't have anything of the sort. So in AA battery and in heavy anti-surface capability, the Gabbianos do have an advantage. Now, you might think, well, why on earth would a short, small, lightweight corvette need any kind of torpedoes? Well, obviously, again, they're built for the Mediterranean. There's a much, much higher chance of them encountering surface raiders, and being the Mediterranean, they're in a fairly enclosed environment. Those surface raiders could be anything from destroyers on upwards. So by having a couple of torpedo launchers aboard, it gives the Gabbianos a chance to, at least to deter, if not necessarily possibly damage, an incoming raider. Bearing in mind that they are supposed to be running around escorting convoys in the Med. So in terms of a corvette as an anti-submarine escort and ability to defend itself, broadly speaking, the Flower class is better. It has a all-round anti-submarine armament. It has somewhat more advanced sonar. It has that ahead firing capability. and it does have that slightly longer range, and it's more crew efficient. But the Flower class, as I said, is designed for an Atlantic environment. The Gabbianos, where they have slightly different equipment in the heavy A battery and the torpedo launchers, which leads to the increased number of crew, that's because they're operating in the Mediterranean in a very enclosed environment where they are going to need all the help they can get. So comparatively, it's difficult to say exactly which one is the best, because they're not designed for the same kind of operating area. Whereas obviously if the Italians were designing the Gabbianos to go out into the Atlantic, they might have wanted to give it a bit more range and not necessarily need the torpedo tubes. Conversely, if the Flowers were designed to go into the Med, they probably would at least have a heavy anti-aircraft battery, if nothing else. Brendan Buersdorf asks, did the Italians ever consider mounting catapult fighters on any of their cruisers or battleships? They did, but they ran across a very important issue quite early on, which is that if you want something to be recoverable, then, well, it needs to have floats. And if you put floats, so you have a float plane, or a hull, so you have a seaplane, then that's going to limit your performance to well below that of a carrier-based or land-based fighter aircraft. And at that point, it's not really worth having a fighter seaplane. So instead, they had a small program which involved the RE-2000s, which was one of the Italian fighters. As you can see here, in the process of being catapulted off the ship, they just navalized a few RE-2000s. It did result in a slight drop in performance, but not a huge amount. Not that the RE-2000 was the world's best fighter in the first place, but it was a fighter still. And they stuck them on their Littorio-class battleships towards the latter part of Italy's involvement in the war. There were never that many of them, and they didn't really achieve anything of any particular note. One of them was launched, I believe, from Vittorio Veneto to try and intercept the German bombers that would ultimately hit Italia and Roma with Fritz X's, sinking the latter in the process. But because they were one shot, they're basically like catapult-launched Hurricanes in the Atlantic convoys. This explains why the Italians didn't launch the half dozen or so that they had across the three battleships, because once they're launched, they are going to have to try and find land, or they're going to have to ditch and hope to be picked up. You're not getting them back. They're one-shot units. Nonetheless, there were a few left on shore that weren't aboard the ships at the time, and ultimately, bizarrely enough, one of those remaining that was on shore comprises one of only two surviving RE-2000s. The other one's in the Swedish Air Force Museum, so the only RE-2000 in existence in Italy, and the one of only two in existence total, is actually one of these navalized catapult RE-2000s. So, yeah, catapult mount fighters, yes, albeit they didn't accomplish all that much. Tom Bogan 03884 asks, it seems that the US and Germany were the only World War II navies that embraced the submarine as an independent raider. Is it accurate to say everyone else was fixated on the fleet scout role? Not really. The Russians, the British, and the Italians all looked into using submarines as independent commerce raiders. The French as well, for that matter, for all that they lasted during the Second World War. And they all tried to exercise those operations the same as the US and Germany. The difference is that the Germans and the Americans were the only ones who had a major theatre in which the enemy had a large amount of commercial shipping to go after. Obviously, the Germans going after British and generally Allied shipping in the Atlantic for the most part, and also to a certain extent in the Mediterranean and across the rest of the world's oceans. The Americans, of course, having the Japanese merchant fleet largely to itself outside of the beginning of the Pacific campaign when the Dutch and the British were involved, and then, of course, right towards the end as well. Whereas the Italians, they tried to get involved in the Battle of the Atlantic and in the Caribbean and in the Mediterranean as well, but they suffered from some drawbacks. As I've mentioned before, the Mediterranean's not exactly brilliant submarine country, and the Italian submarines that could be allocated to the Atlantic were somewhat less numerous than the German ones. The Russians did make a reasonable crack at trying to conduct anti-commerce operations, but again, there wasn't a huge amount of German commercial traffic in the Baltic for them to go after until right up towards the end of the war, and they were on a very, very steep learning curve. The British really, really wanted to go out raiding. Yes, the T-class were designed in part for fleet actions, but the British were really looking forward to knocking out a bunch of enemy merchant ships, except that, well, Germany didn't have a huge merchant fleet going once the war really got started. So, you can't really have a battle of the Atlantic against Germany when there's no German merchant ships to sink. And what German merchant shipping there was tended to stick fairly close to either Germany or occupied territories under very close coastal escort, which made them pretty hard targets. The British did go after enemy commerce in the Mediterranean to a fair degree, and then later on, once they're back in the Pacific, in that case as well. So pretty much everybody did their best to go after enemy shipping. It's just that for most of them, there wasn't a huge amount of enemy shipping for them to go after. The Italians, in fact, are the only ones who built a completely commerce raiding oriented submarine, the Cagney class, I think that's how it's pronounced, which you can see one of them here. And they came up with a rather interesting solution of mounting, as you can see, 8 torpedo tubes forward and 6 aft for a ridiculous number of 14 torpedoes. But they concluded that since merchant ships are less well built than warships, you could get away with using a smaller torpedo, the 18-inch diameter torpedo instead of the 21-inch that most subs used, which is why they could get so many tubes in, and it also meant they could carry a lot of torpedoes. They could carry up to 36, which was well in excess of what most other submarines at the time could carry. The only ones who were really kind of, I guess you could say, mostly all in on the submarine is an arm of anti-fleet warfare exclusively would be the Japanese. But even with them, Japanese subs would go after merchant ships when and where they could, and sometimes would conduct fairly long-range missions to do so. But yeah, if you were going to point to any navies at all and say, right, these guys, they let their commerce hunting opportunities slide when they had decent opportunity to conduct them, that would be the Japanese. Everybody else, it was mostly a lack of targets. Very Silent Mouse asks, where can I find out about the 2 truly vicious Dutch gunboats? This is from the Operation Neptune video. Well, that would be the Flores class gunboats, I think that's how they're pronounced, and they are quite remarkable little ships, because for a displacement roughly comparable with a small 1930s era destroyer, they mount 3 single 5.9-inch, near enough makes no difference, 6-inch guns. You can see 2 of them here on the front of Flores, the other one's hiding under the canopy at the back. And that's pretty much it. There's a minimal anti-aircraft armament, but they are basically carry platforms for these 3 rather oversized for their dimensions guns. The ships do have a little bit of armour as well, which might marks them out as slightly different from destroyers. Not a huge amount, but enough to deflect incoming destroyer fire and I guess a little bit of shore battery fire. But they are really the ultimate colonial vessel in a lot of ways. They've got for their size and just generally is a pretty good fire control system that allows them to take out shore targets with a fair degree of accuracy. But they're not especially fast because they're not destroyers. You can probably tell that from their overall hull shape and size. But luckily for the Dutch Navy, the Flores managed to escape to the UK, and her sister ship ended up in the Far East, but she managed to escape the Japanese. And then once they were reunited in the sort of 1942 period, the Allies discovered, hey, these ships have some really nice fire control systems that allow them to bombard the shore. They have a pretty shallow draft, so they can get nice up and close. They've got a decent amount of protection, so they're actually, they're better than destroyers for the short bombardment work, because 105mm, 75mm field batteries probably going to pose less of a risk to them. And this is what they're designed to do. So with the Dutch crews rather eager to get some revenge in, the Flores class would then be found at all sorts of landings in Italy, and then obviously off the beaches of Normandy, and so on and so forth, quite happily belting 6-inch shells downrange at the Germans at every possible opportunity. So, yeah, that's why they were held to be particularly vicious. They had a lot of motivation, and they had the equipment that allowed them to get up close and personal and then hit very accurately. As for where you can find out about them, there are a number of books that reference them in passing. There's a warship article. They're obviously in Conway's History of the Ship, or Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships. But unfortunately, as is the way with so many small craft from overseas nations, the best histories you're likely to find about them are actually in Dutch. So if you're interested in some of the deeper histories of the ships, then drop me a line and I can send you a link to various Dutch sources which talk about their activities in a fair degree of detail. Lee Belloni asks, my grandfather was in the US Merchant Marine working for Texaco on oil tankers. In World War II, he was on a tanker that was torpedoed and ended up with the imprint of the grates on the bottoms of his feet. Where can I go -search to get more information on which ship and convoy he was on when this occurred? My family doesn't have any additional information. Unfortunately, it's going to be a relatively difficult if that's all the information that's available. If you had a ship, a convoy, or even an area, that would help. But with just that information available, I think you're going to have to start with working out which ships Texaco actually had in their fleet in World War II, which may involve having to write to the company, or even just asking, writing to Texaco and saying, look, this is why I'd like to know, family research. Could you let me know which Texaco-owned ships were sunk during the Second World War? And then from that, you'd probably then be able to work out, based on times and dates, where and when each ship was sunk, what convoy it was in, and so on and so forth, and hopefully begin to narrow things down. But there were quite a few Texaco-owned oil tankers, and a fair number of them were sunk. I mean, the reason you're seeing SS Ohio famously hauled into Malta is because SS Ohio was actually originally a Texaco tanker. So there's quite a few that could have been the one that your grandfather was on. Bismarck Boy 96 asks, if Bismarck didn't detach Prinze Eugen, do you think they would have stood a chance? At least somewhat of a chance. Possibly, but only in one particular circumstance. And that is the air attack that knocks out Bismarck's rudder. If Prinze Eugen is still with Bismarck at that stage, then there are two ways Prinze Eugen could help. One of which is that the swordfish might go after Prinze Eugen instead, which obviously if Prinze Eugen eats a torpedo, that's not necessarily good for it, but Bismarck might survive. Or it might split the attention of the swordfish equally, or something close to it, at which point, the torpedo hit might not happen. Or Prinze Eugen, by adding its anti-aircraft firepower, might dissuade, damage, or shoot down the relevant swordfish. Essentially, if there is something that Prinze Eugen can do during that air attack that means that Bismarck's rudder is not hit and jammed, then they've got the speed to just about make it home. It's going to be a bit of a close run thing, because Prinze Eugen's machinery was on the verge of breaking down by about the time that Bismarck was historically sunk, so she's probably going to haul into harbour just in time to completely collapse machinery-wise, but it is possible. If, however, Prinze Eugen's efforts are for naught and she isn't able to alter the trajectory of that one swordfish that drops that one torpedo that cripples Bismarck's steering, then that's not going to help in much of anything. Because remember that you've got Norfolk and Dorsetshire there, you've got Renown in the offing with obviously Ark Royal. So if Bismarck is crippled and is then limping the way that she was historically, then even the tribal class attacks along with Piron overnight, Prinze Eugen isn't really going to be able to help all that much with that. She's going to be having torpedoes coming in at her as much as anything else. So she's going to be twisting and turning. And in that final battle, the Royal Navy has more than enough ships to deal with Prinze Eugen whilst King George V and Rodney go to town on Bismarck. Admiral Troll asks, what are the reasons why the American and Royal Navies returned to external belts after building ships with sloped internal belts? King George V after Nelson and Montana after Iowa. There were slightly different reasons for both, but the common reason between the Montanas and the King George V moving to external belts was that the ships were considerably easier to construct with external belts, and repairs to battle damage would also have been considerably easier because, well, you can see here in this set of cross-sectional diagrams, Montana's down there in the bottom middle and Iowa on the bottom right, and you can see if Iowa's belt gets damaged, you also have to cut away a bunch of external stuff to get at it first, which is a little bit annoying and can be something of a problem. Now, that's what the two have in common. A specific feature for the Montanas is that obviously the US still wants to retain the sloped angle belt, but when they were building the Iowas and they were restricted to Panamax, as you can see with the Montanas, if you have the sloped belt, you have actually the upper edge of the hull, where it's at the upper edge of the belt, and the hull above it sticks out a fair bit over the waterline. Well, relatively, when I say a fair bit, that's a relative thing. Basically, and there's this indentation. Now, that can have some negative effects on stability. So, on a ship that with limited beam, and bearing in mind having a wide beam helps improve stability, if you're going to have a slope belt, you pretty much have to put it internally in order to maintain maximum beam with minimum effect on your slope belt. With the Montanas, which were not restricted by Panamax capabilities, could be made wide enough to then have an externally sloped belt without any significant compromises in stability. So that's the Montanas. With the King George V's, the internal sloped belt for the Nelsons wasn't a new idea. External slope belts and internal slope belts had been looked at during the British abortive battle cruiser design processes of the early 1920s. And for that matter, the battleship ideas. But as far as the British were concerned, there are a number of other reasons. Because remember, the British went to external and they went back to vertical instead of sloped. And their main concerns, where that differs from the Montanas, were that the sloped belt was quite effective at long range, but by the 1930s, the Royal Navy had resolved its combat doctrine to involve closing to fairly short range, and at fairly short range the effect of angling is quite reduced, and therefore if you have a belt that relies more on its angle than its overall thickness for protection, you're going to be in trouble. So at closer ranges, having a simple slab-sided belt with a greater physical thickness is just better. And the other thing that British records show they were a little bit worried about, which potentially to a degree might also influence the American decision with Iowa, was flooding due to non-penetrating hits. Because as you can see with the Iowas, if a shell comes in and hits the Iowa class's main belt, then assuming it hits somewhere near the waterline, that compartment between the hull skin and the ship's armour will probably be flooded. And if the shell's coming in obviously at a downward angle and it explodes and is rejected by the armour, then fragments plus blast might also open up the top of the torpedo. Defence is further down, at which point you might actually have a fair amount of flooding in the ship as a result of a hit that hasn't actually penetrated the ship's belt protection. And the British were worried somewhat about that. We know that from their design documents. And so an external vertical belt, or external belt of any description really, would keep the shells out completely. So either the shell is rejected and there's minimal damage to the ship, period, or it penetrates, at which point it gets inside anyway, and it would have done that regardless. Giroro Mech asks, is there a legal reason for claiming whether or not Bismarck was sunk or scuttled? Does it affect ownership of the wreck or eventual recovery or something like that? Also, how are maritime war graves protected from looters and by whom? Is there regular surveys of known war graves? There's no particular full legal reason for claiming Bismarck was sunk or scuttled. I mean, there's not prize money for a sunk enemy ship And even if there was, the ship ended up going down, so no one particularly cares exactly how, unless it could be credited to another ship, and scuttling is not viewed as a credit to the ship itself. The ownership of the wreck, it went down flag flying, so it still is a German ship, regardless of whether it was sunk or scuttled. So yeah, there's no particular legal reason. The main reason for claiming that Bismarck was scuttled instead of sunk essentially seems to just be national pride, and some slightly weird people out there who seem to think that they should have national pride in a ship that isn't of their own nation. But there you go. Anyway, in terms of maritime war graves, they are theoretically protected from looters by a number of international treaties about respecting war graves. However, unfortunately, words are only as good as the paper that they're written on unless someone is prepared to go in and enforce them, and there is no systematic survey and then enforcement of the sanctity of shipwrecks as war graves. Most of the security comes from a combination of most shipwrecks are pretty hard to find and then get at in the first place, and be a kind of honour code amongst various nations. Unfortunately, when you get ships that are in relatively shallow waters where the rough location is already broadly known, and you get a bunch of people who don't particularly respect the idea of war graves, or at least they think they can get away with not respecting it, then wrecks get looted fairly quickly. In theory, if a warship came across a ship that was looting a war grave in the open ocean, they might be able to do something about it, especially if that warship was of the nation whose wreck was being looted. But a lot of shipwrecks that are in a position to be looted tend to be in much shallower waters, and those much shallower waters tend to be fairly close to the shore, which then means they tend to be in the territorial or exclusive economic zone waters of various countries, many of whom were former colonies, and A, tend not to have particularly large navies to enforce the things themselves, and B, don't particularly care one way or the other for preserving the wrecks. M. Peterson 6 asks, is there any truth that a United States Coast Guard cutter spotted Bismarck during the hunt? Yes, this is USCGC, I should say, Modoc. There are a couple of stories about her being involved with Bismarck's hunt. The one that everyone seems to universally agree on was that the Modoc was within range of Bismarck while she was under air attack, probably from the aircraft of Ark Royal, and that during that engagement she was nearly hit by falling anti-aircraft fire from Bismarck. So that's something that everybody seems to agree definitely did happen. There is also a story that's told by some but not all sources saying that prior to that, Modoc had spotted Bismarck just straight up, and then she reported that back to the Catalina, which was then able to track Bismarck via its oil slick and find her. But that's a minority. But it does seem that in some way, shape or form during the hunt, this Coast Guard cutter did come into visual range of Bismarck, most likely whilst she was under air attack by Ark Royal Swordfish. Michael S. asks, couldn't they use LIDAR to see through the mud for torpedo damage on Bismarck's wreck? Most likely not, for three reasons. One, I'm not aware that anyone's made a LIDAR unit that's capable of getting down to 3 miles underwater without being crushed like a bug. Second, even if they did, LIDAR can't see through mud. LIDAR can see through some dirt, fog. It can't actually see through tree canopies. What it can do is see around them. Slightly different, but effectively, as far as the human perception is concerned, it sees through tree canopies, but that's not actually how it works. There is a solid intervening seabed it won't be able to see through. But even if you had something that you could get down to that depth and could see through the mud in some way, shape or form, maybe the ultrasonic scanner with its probe embedded in the mud or something like that. The final problem you're going to have looking for torpedo damage, as I outlined in the Bismarck report, is that as far as they can tell, all the decks below the main armour layer have, and possibly even some of the decks above that internal to the ship, have all been smashed up and crumpled up and have suffered from hydraulic blowout when the ship has hit the mud, the seabed, and then slid. So basically what you had is a bunch of water inside the ship, so obviously relatively incompressible and only a limited number of ways for it to get out. The hull has then come down hard on the seabed, at which point that impact has tried to compress the hull and has successfully done so, but that massive buildup of pressure as the hull is compressed on the water that's inside has not many ways to go. The rapidity and force of the impact means that the existing holes, whether they be the barbettes, the shell holes, etc., on the upper part of the ship, aren't enough to get the water that's being compressed out of there fast enough, at which point it's not going to blow the main armor panels off because they're more securely fixed, they're a bit harder. So what's going to happen instead is that the hull plating below the main belt is going to blow out, which, as I said, they have observed has occurred on the bits that they can still see. And as it blows out, then there's no real rigidity to stop the impact just smashing the decks together in a concertina fashion, which it also seems to have happened, at which point the underside of the hull is going to be a mangled wreck, so good luck figuring out which bits of the mangling are due to torpedo damage and which bits are due to the massive crushing impact on landing. And also, as I said, a good chunk of the hull plating will have been blown outwards, so you'll get a bunch of really badly twisted hull plating, which may not even be with the wreck. It may be further upslope or buried somewhere on the scree. And then you've got to figure out, well, was this inside or outside face? And if it's, because then obviously if the inside face is then blown out, then that's hydraulic blowout. If that's the inside face and it's blown in, then that's probably torpedo damage. But where does this plate sit in relation to the rest of the ship? It's going to be very difficult, I think, for anyone to, even if they dredged around the ship, to find much in the way of definitive torpedo damage, given how much damage the landing seems to have done to the hull. Now, of course, the conclusions of the camera report are based only on the parts of the hull under the armour belt, below the armour belt, that they can see. So, who knows, maybe some other parts of it have survived a bit better and they might show torpedo damage, but it's all a bit up in the air at the moment. But first, you've got to invent this sensor that can either see through the mud or invent a dredge machine that can work 3 miles down. Cringepog asks, with relation to the Dardanelles campaign, Anzac folklore, mainly the New Zealand side, holds that during the landings of the Gallipoli campaign, after the British failed to take Chunuk Bair, and the New Zealand Anzacs, of course, were able to take it without much issue, the Royal Navy then shelled the troops off the mountain, since apparently the British believed that, according to the story, if British troops couldn't take the hill, then no one else could, and the resulting fire killed many of the New Zealand troops up there. Is there any level of truth to this story? Well, this being the land-based portion of the Dardanelles, it's not exactly in my wheelhouse. I did manage to find some details, but at the same time, it turns out that one of our patrons is actually from the New Zealand Army and was able to fill in considerably more details, especially since his regiment or battalion is actually a descendant of one of the battalions that was involved. So I will basically read out what he's written. He said it was actually a British and New Zealand attack that took Chunuk Bair. The first attack the previous day had included the British and Auckland troops, and that had failed. Then Colonel Malone and possibly his commanding officer refused to direct an order to assault during the day. Then follow-up assaults, obviously, by the British and the New Zealand portion of the Anzacs managed to take it. There was a naval bombardment that drove off most of the defenders prior to that assault, and there were basically no Ottomans left because, as you can probably tell from this painting, one of the main issues with both attacking Chunuk Bair and defending it is that there's basically no cover. It's just a rocky outcrop. You can't dig in it. There's no soil to dig in it. But if there's a natural defence line like a small crevasse in the rock, it's very difficult to dislodge people from there, except that you also can't see more than 20 to 30 yards before the terrain and the slope means that you can't tell that someone's coming, which, yeah, it's just hell. Anyway, having then taken it with a combined New Zealand-British force, a shell came in and did manage to accidentally kill Colonel Malone. We know it was a friendly shell. Whether it was a shell from land-based artillery or from the Navy is something of a subject of speculation. A couple of different references that I found, some say it was British naval shell, some say it was friendly fire from Anzac supporting artillery, others present both and say we don't know, so take that as you will. And then, because of the casualties involved with taking that hill, I mean, the New Zealand unit that went up there took something like over 90% casualties between their killed and wounded. They were then, everyone who'd been involved in taking the hill was then relieved by further British infantry units, except the Ottomans then turned up with about 6 times as many people as the defenders had and retook the hill shortly thereafter. Dick Collier asks, could you tell us a bit about the capture of U-570 and what the Royal Navy and Kriegsmarine learned from that incident? The capture of U-570 was a very odd thing. She'd gone out on a war patrol with a crew that basically didn't have any active at-sea combat experience. Less than half a dozen men had ever been on a U-boat war patrol at all. And, well, this being one of the hazards of a submarine that actually spends most of its time on the surface, while it was in the North Atlantic, it was obviously being pitched and rolled everywhere. The crew got very seasick, and so to try and mitigate that, the sub decided to submerge and spend some time in a little bit more stable environment, but then obviously had to come back up again. And when it came back up, it was spotted by some patrolling Hudson bombers, which the first one tried to bomb it, couldn't because of mechanical failure issues. Then the second one was called in by the first one. That managed to get a very near hit with some depth charges. And this is where the inexperience of the crew came into effect. Because the sub was so pretty much at the surface, the effect of the depth charges was quite dramatic. Obviously, being depth charge generally is a dramatic experience, but on the surface, where a good chunk of the sub is only got air to resist its movement as opposed to water, it was pitched and rolled very violently. And there was some damage, there's a little bit of leakage, some of the batteries were broken, and the crew saw seawater and broken batteries and immediately concluded what was going to happen when the seawater got to those batteries, which would be a release of toxic gases, and scrambled out and decided to escape. And everybody was like, yep, okay, we don't want to go back into a sub full of chlorine. And so U-570 was kind of left on the surface. They did manage, to be fair, to kind of do a halfway job of smashing up some of their more sensitive equipment. So they did destroy their Enigma machine, although that turns out not to have been too brilliant for them because U-110 had been captured the year before and the Allies already had an Enigma machine. But nonetheless, having done a partial destruction of their sensitive equipment and documents, they were then left sitting on the sub whilst Hudson's and then later a Catalina circled them to keep an eye on them to make sure they didn't sink the sub, which obviously the aircraft didn't know that the submariners had no intention of doing because they didn't want to go back into what they thought was a gas-filled death trap. And then after a embarrassingly long time, some, as you can see here in this photo, some Royal Navy warships showed up. And then everyone was a little confused as to, can we actually capture the sub, or will the Germans try and do something to stop us capturing the sub? In the end, the Royal Navy ships managed to take the crew off after a few of them had been injured by some stray machine gun bullets from what had been supposed to be a warning shot to not sink the sub. So they took the crew off, they took the sub in tow, and by hook or by crook, and after one grounding to make sure it didn't completely flood out, they eventually worked U-570 back to the UK, and the Allies started to analyse her to see what they could learn from the Germans. Now, in terms of what the Allies learned, apart from obviously how they could operate a German submarine, the main thing that came away from it was
the phraseology and abbreviations that German submarines used, because although they already got an Enigma machine and although they were already making progress in cracking German codes, quite a lot of the time there would be acronyms and slang that would be used in transmissions that they didn't really understand. A lot of the code books that survived and reference book works that had survived in the sub contained a lot of this information. So although it didn't help the Royal Navy crack the codes themselves, the capture of the sub did help the Royal Navy understand what it had once it had gotten those messages in plain text. As far as the Germans were concerned, what they learned was basically don't put inexperienced crews on submarines, and they started breaking up experienced crews into cadres, which would then form the core of new submarine crews. Brian Smith asks, you've used the term American levels of anti-aircraft firepower. How did the amount of American anti-aircraft guns compare to other navies throughout the war, in terms of anti-aircraft guns per ton or by class during different years? The amount of anti-aircraft firepower carried by American warships during World War II varies quite considerably. At the start of the war, both at the start of World War II itself and at the start of World War II for the US, whether that be 1939 and late 1941, believe it or not, actually American ships were not at the top of the game when it came to anti-aircraft firepower. Now, to be fair, they were far from the bottom, but when you consider the typical American pre-war treaty light cruiser, so we use light cruisers as a comparison for this because doing it per ton for the various ship classes would be a Wednesday video in itself, and you'll recall from my video comparing unarmoured to armoured flight decks on carriers that Ark Royal versus Yorktown, you actually end up in a similar position, the same with Illustrious versus Yorktown. So looking at a Brooklyn class, going into the war, they have 8 5-inch guns, whether that be single 5-inch 25s or twin 5-inch 38s, depending on which Brooklyn you're looking at. They have 8 machine guns as well, but you can basically ignore those for useful anti-air. So effectively, they have 8 heavy caliber anti-aircraft guns. A pre-war British treaty light cruiser, again looking for maximum tonnage, i.e. the Towns. The typical Towns have 8 4-inch, so 8 4-inch, 8 5-inch. Okay, the Americans have got slightly bigger guns, but the same number of guns. But then the British also have 8 40mm. They have 8 40mm barrels in terms of 2 quad pom-poms, and then some machine guns. But again, we're not really counting those. And then at the top of the tier for the Towns, you have Belfast and Edinburgh, which are a little bit larger, but they have 12 4-inch guns as opposed to 8 5-inch guns, and they have 16 40mm guns in the form of 2 octuple pom-poms, which again, the Brooklyns don't have anything of when they're initially built. But things evolve, so more and more guns are fitted, and where the kind of joke of American levels of firepower comes in is not just that the Americans were willing to increase the anti-aircraft armament of their ships, pretty much everybody was, but it's a combination of increasing the numbers, or being willing to increase the numbers, and actually being able to do that on a large scale, thanks to having large amounts of industrial capacity, and then also then being effective weapons. Because if you want to go by sheer barrel count, something like a Japanese Atago class towards the end of the war would probably win, because they just festoon the thing in 25mm mounts. But as we know, whether it comes in single, twin or triple, the 25mm is by far and away not really an effective anti-aircraft gun. Then when you look at the latter war fit-outs of American, again, we're looking at light cruisers in this case, and now we'll look at a Cleveland. So the Clevelands have 12 5-inch guns. So if we broadly, and I'm talking in very broad terms, approximate and say, okay, well, it's a heavy AA gun. When we looked at Belfast and Edinburgh, bear in mind these are the top tier British Town class. Edinburgh's sunk at this point, but Belfast has had 6 twin 4-inch mounts, so they both have the same number of heavy AA guns, at least in 1944, but Belfast loses 2 of her twin mounts, so she only now is back to 8 guns, and she can bring to bear 4 heavy AA guns per side, whereas with the Clevelands, because they have that 4.5 twin 5-inch mount, that means that they can bring 8 guns per side to bear. And even if Belfast had retained her aft to 4-inch twin mounts, she would still have been able to bring 6 guns to bear per side, so that would be around the time of D-Day. And then, again, looking at a Cleveland in terms of its medium-light anti-aircraft battery, you've now got 28 40mm guns, or Bofors, and 10 20mm guns. Now, by comparison, Belfast, okay, being the largest ship, although she's now already losing out in the heavy AA department, she does kind of win out in the light and medium anti-aircraft department, because she's carrying 2 octuple pom-poms, so that's 16 barrels already, 4 quad pom-poms, so that's another 16 barrels, so she's already up to 32 barrels, so she's up to 4 more than the Bofors on a late war Cleveland. She's then got 4 singles, pushing up to 36, and then there is also some Bofors popping around, another 5 Bofors, so you're up to 41 40mm barrels, and then there's also 8 20mm Oerlikons in a mixture of twin and single mounts. But that is using the best case scenario, which is, as I said, Belfast, and Belfast's heavy AA is still somewhat insufficient, whereas if compared to a Cleveland, whereas if you look at something like Glasgow or Liverpool, which would be more typical town class at that point. Now, to be fair, they have 6 quadruple pom-poms, as opposed to 2 octuples and 4 quadruples. So that's 6 multiplied by 4. That's 24 barrels, but that's 4 barrels less in Bofors terms. And then they have, depending on the ship, they average around about the same number of Oerlikons as a Cleveland. And, again, have less heavy AA. So the American cruisers, by the end of the war, have usually an advantage in overall anti-aircraft batteries, and even something like Belfast, which is the all-singing, all-dancing star of the Royal Navy light cruisers, is, although it can outgun a US light cruiser in light-medium anti-aircraft firepower, it's paid for that in not being able to outgun it in heavy firepower, in fact, being half as heavy in anti-aircraft firepower from long-range AA. And then you factor in, of course, as I said before, the effectiveness. So radar-guided, remote power control, proximity fuses for the 5-inch guns, etc., etc. And that's why you get the saying American levels of firepower, because essentially only their immediate allies, the British, can really compete in terms of bringing the sheer number of guns to the table. And thanks to American industry, generally speaking, the average American ship will still have more guns, and usually, barring a few outliers, they'll usually be somewhat more effective because of the widespread use of remote power control and so forth. And, you know, if you go back to late 43 and then into 1944, the difference becomes somewhat more acute, because thanks to a variety of factors, including industrial shortages, when you're looking at the very end war state of British anti-aircraft firepower, a lot of it has been augmented in late 44 and 45 by the release of weapons partly from the US, but also the lessening pressure by Italy bowing out of the war and the Kriegsmarine becoming much less of a threat, which has allowed them to catch up with a point that the US was already at, thanks to, again, that huge industrial capacity. And just a quick reminder that our ShipShape crowdfunder for the Australia trip in June is in the video description below. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And I hope to see you again in another dry dock as we soldier on through May.